Okay, so we're doing Chapter 10, Lesson 7, Part 2. We were working through number 6. For Part A, you can see we had 2x squared plus 15x plus 7. We start off with 2x squared in the top left box, 7 in the bottom right box. We multiplied the coefficient of the x squared with our constant. 2 times 7 is 14. We found the factor pairs. We found the factor pair that added to 15, and then we placed the 1 and the 14x into our boxes, found the greatest common factor for each row and for each column, and that is how we factored out the equation. So now we're going to do another problem from number 6. Excuse me. Let's look at part D. Part D is 25x squared minus 1. Okay, one thing you might notice here is that our first term and our last term are both squares. We can rewrite our first term as 5x quantity squared and our last term as 1 squared. That's a difference of two squares. Difference of two squares we know how to factor without having to do anything complicated. It's the first term plus the second term multiplied by the first term minus the last term. So it will be 5x plus 1 times 5x minus 1. So anytime you see something that is a difference of two squares, it's going to be very easy to factor. Okay, let's jump down to part E now. Part E is 3x squared plus 7x minus 6. We'll draw our grid. Okay. Put in our grid lines. Okay, so we know we're going to have a 3x squared in the top left box, and we're going to have a negative 6 in the bottom right box. Now what we need to do is multiply the coefficient of the x squared with our constant. 3 times 6 is 18. We need to find all the factor pairs that make 18. So that's 1 times 18. That's 2 times 9. And that's 3 times 6. And that's all the factor pairs that make 18. Now, notice that our 6 is negative. Since it is negative, we need to find which factor pair has a difference of 7. Now, here's the thing that you can use that's going to make it easy to figure out whether you need to find the sum of the factor pairs or the difference. If the sign in front of your constant is positive, then you will add your factors together. If this is negative, then you will subtract them. So this is negative. That means we need to find the difference between the two factors, and we need to find the pair of factors that have a difference of 7. 18 minus 1 is 17, so that won't work. But 9 minus 2 is 7, so that does work. This is a positive. That means our bigger factor needs to be positive. The bigger number is 9. So we're going to have a plus 9x and a minus 2x. Then for each row and column, we need to find the greatest common factor. Greatest common factor in the first row is 3x. Greatest common factor in the bottom row is negative 2. In the first column, the greatest common factor is x. In the second column, the greatest common factor is 3. So to factor this equation, we need x plus 3 times 3x minus 2. Okay, so now we're going to do part F. Part F is 3x squared minus 9x plus 6. Now, this equation you have to be very careful with. Notice all of our coefficients are multiples of 3. That means we can't do anything with this yet. The first thing we have to do is factor out our greatest common factor. Our greatest common factor is 3. So 3 times x squared will make 3x squared. 3 times a negative 3x will make negative 9x. 3 times a positive 2 will make 6. So x squared minus 3x plus 2 is what we have to factor. So we can draw a grid if you'd like for that. Here's a grid. Put in our grid lines. And we need to make x squared minus 3x plus 2. We know that we have to have an x and an x here because there's no coefficient in front of the x. In front of the x squared, it must be just a 1. To get 2, you have to multiply 2 and 1. So we have a 2x and an x. This is negative, so it means that we must have a negative 2 and a negative 1. So we have a negative x and a negative 2x. So this factors to 3 times x minus 1 times x minus 2. So be very careful. One of the things you might want to do first is check to see if you have any equations that have common factors. And if you do have a common factor in an equation, you've got to make sure that you factor that out before you do anything else. So we're going to do just one more part from number 6. We'll do part G. So number 6G is 8x squared plus 22x plus 15. Okay, there is not a common factor for all of these because 15 is odd, 8 and 22 are even. So we're going to make our grid. And when we make our grid and draw our grid lines, we are going to put 8x squared in the top left box. And we're going to put 15 in the bottom right box. Now, we need to multiply the 8 by the 15 to figure out our factor pairs. So 120 is 8 times 15. There are a lot of factor pairs that make 120. There's 1 times 120, 2 times 60, 3 times 40, 4 times 30, 5 times 24, 6 times 20, 8 times 15, and 10 times 12. Notice that the 15 is positive. That's a plus. That means we need to add our two factors to try and find something that adds up to 22. 1 plus 120 is 121. 2 plus 60 is 62. 3 plus 40 is 43. 4 plus 30 is 34. 5 plus 24 is 29. 6 plus 20 is 26. 8 plus 15 is 23. But 10 plus 12, that is 22. So we're going to have a 10x and we're going to have a 12x. They are both going to be positive because this is positive. So greatest common factor in our first row is going to be 2x. Greatest common factor in our second row is going to be 3. Greatest common factor in our first column is 4x. Greatest common factor in our second column is 5. So this would factor out as 2x plus 3 times 4x plus 5. So this was number 6, which is just like number 11 that I assigned for homework. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is number 7. Number 7 says use the diagrams below to factor each of the following polynomials. Okay, so for number 7, you're provided with a diagram which works out a polynomial. So you're given the polynomial, like part A says 6x squared minus xy minus y squared, and then there's a grid below with it worked out. And all you have to do is write down the factors. So for this one, the factors are all that you write down because they have already provided you with the polynomial written out completely. So all you would have to do here is write down the factor pair that's on the side. The factor that's on the side and write down the factor that's across the top. And you are done. The next one that's over here is part B, 8x squared minus 11xy plus 3y squared. And the grid is already provided for you. All you have to do is write out the factor pair that makes that polynomial, which is going to be x minus y times 8x minus 3y. So that's how you would work number 7, which is just like number 12 that I assigned as homework. Okay, the last one we're going to look at is number 8, which just says factor the following polynomials. So let's look at part A. Part A, we have 5x squared plus 16xy plus 3y squared. So we're going to start off by drawing a grid and putting in our grid lines. Okay, we know the top left box is 5x squared and the bottom right box is 3y squared. I said squared and I wrote cubed. Okay, 3y squared. Actually, I should say the very first thing you do is check to see if you have common terms. And we don't. There's 5, 16, and 3. Greatest common factor is 1. We have x's in 2 of the terms, but not in the third. We have y's in 2 of the terms, but not in all 3. So there is the greatest common factor of the 3 terms is just 1. Okay, so we've made our grid. We put 5x squared in the top left box. We put 3y squared in the bottom right box. Now we need to multiply our coefficients here. 5 times 3 is 15, and find all the factor pairs that make 15. So we can make 15 with 1 times 15 or with 3 times 5. Now we look at the sign in front of our last term. It's positive. That means we're going to add our factors. What are we going to try to get them to add to? We want them to add to 16. Well, that's going to be 1 and 15. So we've got a 1 and we have a 15. 1 and 15 what's? Well, 1 and 15 xy's. So now for the first row, we find the greatest common factor, which happens to be x, not f. For the second row, we get our greatest common factor, which is 3y. First column, greatest common factor is 5x. Second column, greatest common factor is y. So we would factor this as x plus 3y times 5x plus y. Okay, so the next one we're going to try is 8b. 8b says 8x squared minus 30xy plus 7y squared. Our greatest common factor is 1, so we don't have to factor anything out. I'm going to draw my grid. And we know that in the top left box, we'll put 8x squared, and in the bottom right box, we will put our 7y squared. Okay, now we multiply our coefficient of the first term by the coefficient of the last term. 8 times 7 is 56. Now we write down all the factor pairs that make 56. We have 1 times 56. We have 2 times 28. We have 4 times 14. And we have 7 times 8. Those are all the factor pairs that make 56. Now, this is a plus sign in front of our last term. That means we're going to add our factors together. They need to add to 30. Well, 2 and 28 is the pair that adds to 30, so we're going to put a 2 and a 28. They both need to be negative because this is negative, so negative 2 and negative 28. And they need to be xy's, so xy. Now, first row, greatest common factor is 2x. Second row, greatest common factor is 7y. We also know this must be negative because we must have 2 negatives to add together to get a negative and 2 negatives to multiply together to get a positive. Okay, first column, greatest common factor is 4x. Second column, greatest common factor is y. And we're going to make that negative because we need both of our terms here to be negative so they can multiply together to become a positive. So when we write out the factored form, it's 2x minus 7y times 4x minus y. So when you are working out these problems, remember if your last term is positive, that means you're going to add the factor pair, the 2 factors. If this last term is negative, you're going to subtract them. And that's really about it.